This isn't just another viral clip, it's a historic moment. When J.D. Vance schooled that arrogant journalist, the entire media world stood still. His response didn't just silence the studio, it sent shockwaves through the industry. This story time will change how you see modern journalism, and you won't forget it. Under the harsh glow of the studio lights, tension thickened like an impending storm. The audience, a sea of eager faces and restless bodies, leaned forward in anticipation. J.D. Vance, the newly inaugurated Vice President of the United States, walked onto the set, his steps measured, his expression calm yet alert. Fresh from taking his oath of office, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had nothing to hide and everything to prove. Yet across from him sat Logan Harper, the talk show host notorious for his cutting interviews and sharp political bias. Harper's smile was polite but tight, his eyes betraying an intent far from friendly. This wasn't going to be an interview, it was an ambush. Harper wasted no time, his words dripping with a forced sweetness that fooled no one. "Mr. Vice President," he began, cards clenched tightly in his hands. "Let's talk about your remarkable journey from Trump critic to his second in command." Vance smiled, the kind that reaches the eyes of someone who has weathered storms far fiercer than pointed words. "That's actually a perfect place to start, Logan," he replied, voice steady. "Because it speaks to something bigger than politics, it speaks to America's capacity for growth and understanding." The audience murmured, intrigued. Harper, expecting defensiveness, shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't going to be as easy as he thought. "Growth and understanding?" Harper pressed, mockery lacing his tone. "Some might call it political convenience." Vance didn't flinch. "In America, we have this incredible tradition changing our minds when presented with new information. When I criticized the president years ago, I viewed things through a narrow lens. But I witnessed something remarkable. His policies genuinely helped the forgotten Americans I wrote about." A hush fell over the crowd. Harper's jaw tightened. This wasn't going according to script. Vance leaned in, gaze unwavering. "Let me ask you something, Logan. Have you ever changed your mind about something important? Ever looked at evidence and realized you were wrong?" Harper's pause stretched a beat too long, discomfort flashing in his eyes. "We're here to discuss your changes, Mr. Vice President." "Not mine," he deflected, shuffling his cards to regain control. "Speaking of changes," Harper pivoted, "let's discuss your recent speech at the National Prayer Breakfast. Don't you think invoking divine guidance in government decisions dangerously mixes church and state?" A collective breath caught in the audience's throat. Harper had just stepped onto sacred ground. Vance's eyes glinted with calm fire. "What I said," he replied, voice rich with conviction, "was that our founding fathers valued moral guidance. They feared tyranny, not faith." A few amens echoed from the crowd. Harper's lips thinned. "But in today's diverse society, let me finish," Vance interjected gently but firmly. "When I took my oath, I placed my hand on the Bible like countless leaders before me, not to impose religion, but to acknowledge that our rights come from God, not government." Harper glanced at his producer, nervous tension crackling behind the cameras, but Vance pressed on. "Funny thing, Logan, when I was a Marine, no one questioned our chaplain's presence. Before missions, even skeptics joined in prayer. Because in moments where lives hang in the balance, politics fall away. What remains is faith in something greater." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Harper's face flushed. He had to change the subject and fast. "Let's move on," Harper said, voice strained. "Your relationship with President Trump, calling him God's instrument, each you think that's extreme." Vance's gaze didn't waver. "What's extreme is how some media outlets focus more on whether a leader prays than on policies impacting American families." The words hung heavy in the air. "But since you brought up results, let's talk about what's actually happening in communities since the inauguration." The room shifted, energy palpable, eyes fixed on Vance. Even Harper, known for interrupting at will, found himself quieted. "You've written about your humble beginnings," Harper tried again, desperate for a foothold. "Yet now you sit in the halls of power. Some say you've forgotten where you came from." Vance chuckled softly. "Where I come from, Logan, we judge people by character, not by how well they fit Washington's expectations." Harper scoffed, but his jabs were losing steam. "Character? Is that what you call reversing your stance on Trump?" Vance's gaze sharpened. "Character is admitting when you're wrong, even when critics twist it into something else." The audience stirred, a wave of murmurs and nods rippling through. Harper tugged at his collar, visibly rattled. The tension was thick enough to cut. Vance, unwavering, concluded, "You know what I see, Logan? Someone who believes an expensive suit changes a man's values. But the values I carry, the ones my grandmother instilled in me, don't shift with titles or zip codes." The room pulsed with quiet awe. Harper, cards trembling slightly in his hands, realized what everyone else in the studio already knew. This was no longer his interview. Vance had taken control not with volume or anger, but with calm resolve and undeniable truth. Under the intense studio lights, the tension thickened like a storm about to break. The audience shifted in their seats, eyes darting between J.D. Vance and Logan Harper, the host who seemed determined to corner him. Harper's tone sharpened as he leaned in. You wrote quite passionately against him before. Now, here you are defending him. Don't you see the irony? The air dropped 10 degrees. The murmurs in the audience grew louder, some nodding in agreement, others waiting to see Vance's reaction. But Vance didn't flinch. If anything, a subtle smile played at the corner of his mouth, a calm before the storm. You know what I see, Logan. Vance's voice was steady, his gaze unwavering. I see someone who thinks an expensive suit changes a man's values. He gently touched his chest, eyes briefly glancing at the crowd. The values I carry ones from my grandmother in Middletown, Ohio, don't shift with a zip code or job title. His words hung in the air like a bell echoing through a silent church. The audience grew quiet, absorbing the weight of his conviction. Harper, undeterred, pressed on. So you're saying your transformation has nothing to do with political ambition? His words were laced with skepticism, searching for cracks in Vance's composure. Vance's eyes hardened, yet his tone remained calm. What I'm saying, Logan, is that unlike some folks in the media, I don't measure success by how many people I can please. He paused, letting the statement sink in. I measure it by staying true to the principles I was raised with. Harper shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable with how the interview was slipping from his grasp. Desperation crept into his voice. So we're supposed to ignore your past criticisms. Just accept that you're now, he paused, voice dripping with condescension, Trump's puppet. The word landed like a grenade. Several audience members audibly gasped. The tension was suffocating, but Vance's reaction was surgical in its precision. He leaned forward, gaze sharp as a blade. You know, Logan, he said softly, that word says more about you than it does about me. The audience stirred, sensing the shift. In your world, loyalty to someone you respect is something to mock. But let me tell you what I learned as a Marine. His voice carried the weight of battle-tested wisdom. In combat, you don't judge a person by what the media says. You judge them by their actions. The audience erupted in applause, the sound reverberating through the studio. Harper opened his mouth to interrupt, but Vance held up a hand, commanding the room without raising his voice. I've seen President Trump's character firsthand, not the caricature you and your colleagues paint. You call it being a puppet? I call it recognizing leadership. Harper's jaw tightened, struggling to regain control. Surely a man of your intellectual background sees the contradiction in supporting someone you once criticized, he retorted, his voice now tinged with frustration. There you go again, Vance replied smoothly. So focused on contradictions, you missed the point entirely. His words were calm but struck like hammers. The real contradiction would be ignoring what I've seen with my own eyes, just to please critics like yourself. The applause swelled again, thunderous, unwavering. Harper glanced at his producer, who was gesturing wildly off camera, a silent plea to redirect. But Vance wasn't done. And since you brought up my intellectual background, he added with a hint of a smile, why don't we talk about the intellectual dishonesty I've seen in your coverage of this administration? Harper's composure cracked. My coverage, his voice rose, defensive. We're not here to discuss, but we are, Vance interjected, his calmness now an iron wall. Just last week, you spent an entire segment questioning my faith, calling it what was it? Convenient election season Christianity. Harper's face reddened. I was merely pointing out the timing of what? Vance leaned in, eyes locked. That I've attended the same church long before I entered politics. Or maybe you'd like to question my grandmother's faith to the woman who taught me to pray before every meal, even when we barely had food. If you find these stories inspiring and they motivate you to take action, please comment 9. If not, comment 0. Your feedback means a lot to us. Thank you for your valuable time. The room fell silent, the weight of Vance's words pressing down on everyone. A woman in the front row nodded vigorously, her expression fierce with support. Harper stumbled, voice faltering. That's not what I let me be clear, Vance cut in, voice carrying both steel and sincerity. Question my politics, disagree with my decisions, that's fair. But when you suggest my faith is some political prop, you're not just attacking me. His gaze swept the audience. You're attacking every American who holds their faith close. Harper fumbled with his notes, searching for safer ground. Let's talk about your recent statements, yes, Vance said, seizing the moment. Let's. He paused, then added, Like when you said people who support traditional values are living in the past. The silence was deafening. Tell me, Logan, the Americans who attend church every Sunday, who believe in family, who love this country, are they all just living in the past? Harper's carefully constructed facade was crumbling. He opened his mouth, but no words came. Vance didn't wait. You see, Logan, he said, his voice now a quiet force, this isn't about politics. It's about respect for faith, for tradition, for the people who don't need your approval to love their country. The audience's response was immediate. Applause erupted like a wave, engulfing the room. Harper, face pale, glanced helplessly at his producer. The planned ambush had become a masterclass in composure and conviction. And Vance's final words cut through the noise like a blade. You invited me here thinking you could corner me. But what really bothers you is simple. Someone like me, someone from Middletown, can sit here, believe what I believe, and not bow to your narrative. The standing ovation was deafening, echoing long after the camera stopped rolling. The studio air felt electric. Every word from J.D. Vance cut through the room like a blade. Logan Harper's carefully orchestrated plan to corner the vice president was unraveling. Vance's gaze didn't waver. His words were calm but carried the weight of 1,000 truths. You and your colleagues, he said, seem to have this deep-seated contempt for regular Americans. The audience grew still, the tension so thick it could be sliced with a knife. Harper shifted in his chair, sweat beginning to form at his brow. You invited me here thinking you could shame me, Vance continued, his voice steady. Shame me for my beliefs, my background, my support for the president. He paused, his eyes sweeping across the audience. But let's talk about what really bothers you. His words hung in the air like a warning before a storm. The room leaned in, everyone waiting for the next strike. It bothers you, Vance pressed on, that someone can come from where I came from and not subscribe to your worldview. His voice rose, not in volume but in conviction. It bothers you that I can be educated at Yale Law School and still believe in traditional values. His gaze locked with Harper's, challenging, unflinching. Most of all, it bothers you that I can see through the game you're playing. The audience murmured in agreement, the momentum shifting entirely to Vance. Harper attempted to regain control. Your accusations, he began. But Vance cut him off with precision. They're not accusations, Logan. They're observations. His tone, calm yet sharp, was impossible to ignore. Like how you rolled your eyes when I mentioned prayer earlier. Or how you mockingly referred to my hometown as Trump country on your show last week. The rebuke hit like a thunderclap. The audience gasped, some glancing at Harper to see how he'd recover. He didn't. His face drained of color. Even his producer standing off camera watched with wide-eyed concern. Vance let the silence stretch, commanding the space. You see, he continued, this isn't about politics. It's about respect. He paused, letting the words sink into every corner of the room. Respect for faith. Respect for traditional values. Respect for the millions of Americans who don't need your approval to love their country. The audience exploded into applause. Harper glanced at his watch, a nervous tick Vance caught immediately. Checking the time already? Vance noted with a slight smirk. Funny. I've noticed you doing that ever since we started talking about faith and values. The audience chuckled, their earlier tension melting into support for the vice president. Harper's discomfort was now palpable. For someone who prides himself on hard-hitting journalism, Vance added, you seem remarkably eager to change the subject when the conversation doesn't go your way. Desperate, Harper launched one final attempt. Is this the same kind of deflection you use when you switch from criticizing Trump to praising him? There you go again, Vance replied calmly. You keep circling back to that like it's some sort of gotcha moment. He leaned in, voice low but firm. Have you ever changed your mind about someone after getting to know them personally? After seeing their true character instead of relying on media narratives? An elderly woman in the audience called out, tell him, Mr. Vice President. The crowd erupted in agreement. Harper's face twisted in frustration, his composure unraveling. You know what the real story is here, Logan. Vance's tone carried the weight of conviction. It's not about my past criticisms or my current position. It's about something that terrifies you and your colleagues, the idea that someone can think for themselves. He paused. That someone can change their mind based on direct experience and still stand firm in their beliefs, despite relentlessly. Harper's face glistened with sweat. Mr. Vice President, you're twisting my words. No, Logan, Vance cut in. I'm holding up a mirror. His words hit like a hammer. And I don't think you like what you see. He turned to the audience, his voice resonating with quiet strength. This man came here hoping to embarrass me, he said, gesturing toward Harper. But instead, he exposed his own prejudices. The audience roared in approval, some production crew members nodding in agreement. When I first met President Trump, Vance continued, I had a choice. Stick to my preconceptions or judge him by his actions, by his genuine love for this country. His gaze swept the room. I chose truth over pride. Maybe your network should try that sometime. Harper shot a desperate glance at his producer, who was now making frantic slashing motions across his throat, the universal signal to wrap it up. But Vance wasn't done. Not yet. And you know what else, Logan? His voice lowered, drawing everyone in. The American people are tired. They're tired of being looked down upon for their faith, tired of being mocked for their values, and most of all, tired of journalists who think their job is to tell people what to think instead of reporting the truth. The audience shot to their feet in a standing ovation so loud it shook the studio. Harper's attempts to speak were drowned out by the thunderous applause. His carefully planned ambush had backfired spectacularly. Harper cleared his throat, deflated. Well, I think we're about out of time. Yes, Vance agreed, rising from his chair. I believe we are. He paused, then turned to the camera, his expression sincere and resolute. But before I go, I'd like to say one last thing to the American people watching at home. The studio grew silent. Even the cameras seemed to hold their breath. What you've witnessed today isn't just about one interview, Vance began, his voice a calm force. It's about something much bigger. It's about standing firm in your convictions. He glanced at the audience, who watched him with rapt attention. They thought they could shame me for my faith, mock my support for President Trump, make me apologize for believing in traditional values. His gaze hardened. But here's what they don't understand. These aren't just political positions. They're the principles that built America, the values that sustained us through hard times, the truths that will guide us forward. He straightened his tie. To every American who's been ridiculed for their faith, who's been mocked for their values, who's been told they're on the wrong side of history, stand strong. His words landed like a promise. Because at the end of the day, character isn't about winning the approval of critics. It's about staying true to what you believe in. The audience erupted again, louder than before, their standing ovations seeming to shake the very walls of the studio. Harper sat in stunned silence, watching as Vance walked off the set, head held high. His ambush had been dismantled, not with anger, not with bluster, but with unwavering principle and quiet strength. And that's the thing about truth. It doesn't need to shout to be heard. Sometimes the strongest answer to bias is dignity, and the most powerful response to arrogance is unshakable conviction. What does it mean to stand firm in your beliefs when the world seems determined to tear you down? The story of J.D. Vance on that stage isn't just about politics, fame, or public confrontation. It's about something far deeper and far more universal: the courage to be true to yourself, even when every voice around you demands that you conform. How many times in life have you faced moments where standing up for what you believe in felt like standing alone in a storm, where the easier choice was to stay silent, to nod along, to avoid conflict? Yet, as Vance demonstrated, true integrity isn't measured by how many people agree with you. It's measured by how deeply you are rooted in your convictions when the spotlight turns harsh and the questions grow sharp. There's a powerful lesson here for all of us. Strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it speaks quietly but firmly. Sometimes it's the steady heartbeat that refuses to waver when challenged. Vance could have crumbled under the weight of ridicule, could have backpedaled or softened his stance, but he didn't. He chose to speak not just for himself, but for countless people who have been belittled for holding on to values that others deem outdated or inconvenient. What struck me most was the reminder that character is forged in fire. It's easy to hold on to principles when no one's watching. But what about when the cameras are rolling? The audience is divided, and every word you speak could twist it against you. That's when you find out what you truly stand for. And let's be honest, how many of us have been in that position? Maybe not on national television, but in a family gathering, at work, or among friends, where sharing your truth feels risky. What this story teaches us is that you don't have to be loud to be powerful. You just have to be unwavering. Vance's calm in the face of hostility is a call to each of us. Be the person who stands tall when others bow to pressure. Be the voice of conviction when it's easier to stay quiet. So, here's my challenge to you. What do you stand for? And when the moment comes, because it will you have the courage to speak up? Remember, at the end of the day, it's not about pleasing the crowd. It's about looking in the mirror and knowing you stood for something that mattered. In a world quick to criticize, let's be people who stand firm, speak truth, and lead with dignity.